I was 69 years old when my son Robert beat me and threw me out into the pouring rain. His wife Diane leaned out the window and shouted that I was no longer welcome in their home. The door slammed shut behind me, and I stood there on the porch, my clothes soaking through, watching the lights go out one by one inside the house where I had lived for the past 3 years. I had nowhere to go. My husband Thomas had passed away 5 years earlier, and I had sold our little house to help Robert with his business. He promised me I would always have a home with him. But promises, I learned that night, can fade like morning mist. The rain came down harder. I pulled my thin cardigan tighter around my shoulders and started walking. My hip ached with each step, a reminder of the fall I had taken last winter. The streets were empty. Most folks were inside their warm homes, probably sitting down to dinner with their families. I thought about calling my daughter Helen, but she lived 2 states away with her own family. I didn't want to burden her. I had spent my whole life trying not to be a burden to anyone. After walking for what felt like hours, I found myself at the old community center on Maple Street. There was a light on inside. I remembered that Pastor Williams sometimes kept the place open on rainy evenings for anyone who needed shelter. My feet carried me up the steps and I knocked softly on the door. A young woman answered. She couldn't have been more than 30, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her name was Sarah, she told me, and she was a volunteer. She didn't ask questions. She simply took my wet coat, brought me a blanket and a cup of hot tea, and sat with me until I stopped shivering. That night, I slept on a cot in the community center. It wasn't comfortable, but it was warm and dry. In the morning, Sarah was there again with coffee and toast. She sat across from me at the small table and asked if I had anyone I could call. I shook my head. Pride has a way of keeping our mouths shut, even when we need help the most. Sarah told me about a small boarding house run by a woman named Dorothy. It was just a few blocks away, and Dorothy sometimes took in folks who were going through hard times. Sarah made a phone call, and within an hour, I was standing on Dorothy's front porch. Dorothy was about my age, maybe a few years younger. She had silver hair pulled back in a bun and wore an apron covered in flour. The smell of fresh bread filled the hallway as she welcomed me inside. She showed me to a small room on the 2nd floor. It had a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over a garden. The walls were painted a soft yellow, the color of butter. Dorothy told me I could stay as long as I needed, and we would work out the details later. I cried that night, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming kindness of strangers who owed me nothing. The next morning, I came downstairs to find Dorothy in the kitchen. She handed me a cup of coffee and asked if I knew how to make biscuits. I smiled for the first time in days and said yes. My mother had taught me when I was just a girl. We worked side by side that morning, our hands covered in flour, talking about everything and nothing. Dorothy had lost her husband 10 years earlier. She had opened the boarding house because she knew what it felt like to be alone. Days turned into weeks. I helped Dorothy with the cooking and cleaning. In the evenings, we would sit on the front porch and watch the neighborhood children play. Sometimes other residents would join us. We would share stories from our lives. There was Harold, retired teacher who had lost his apartment when the building was sold. There was Betty, whose children had grown up and moved away, leaving her in a house too big and too quiet. We were all people who had somehow fallen through the cracks. But here, in Dorothy's house, we had found each other. One afternoon, about 2 months after I had arrived, there was a knock at the door. Dorothy answered it, and I heard a familiar voice. My daughter Helen had found me. She rushed into the kitchen where I was peeling potatoes and wrapped her arms around me. She was crying. She said Robert had finally called her and told her what had happened. She had been looking for me ever since Helen wanted me to come live with her. She had already prepared a room. But I looked around Dorothy's kitchen at the bread rising on the counter, at Dorothy smiling from the doorway, Kay, and I realized something important. I had spent my whole life taking care of other people. I had raised my children, nursed my husband through his final illness, and tried so hard to be useful to Robert and Diane. But here, in this house full of people who had also known loss and disappointment, I had found something different. I had found a place where I could just be myself. I told Helen I loved her and I would visit often. But this was my home now. She didn't understand at first. But as we sat together that evening on the front porch with Dorothy and Harold and Betty, she began to see what I had found. This wasn't just a place to live. It was a family we had chosen for ourselves. Robert never apologized. Some wounds run too deep for sorry to fix. But I learned to let that go. Forgiveness, I discovered, isn't always about the other person. Sometimes it's about freeing yourself from the weight of anger and hurt. I'm 72 now. I still live in Dorothy's boarding house. We have new residents sometimes, and old ones move on. But the heart of this place remains the same. We take care of each other. I've learned that family isn't always the people you're born to. Sometimes it's the people who choose to stand beside you when the rain is falling and the night is dark. Sometimes it's the strangers who become friends, share their bread and their stories and their quiet moments of grace. Life has taught me that kindness is never wasted. Every small act of compassion creates ripples we may never see. Sarah didn't have to help me that rainy night. Dorothy didn't have to open her door, but they did, and in doing so, they gave me something more precious than shelter. They gave me hope, and in the end, hope is what keeps us going. Hope and the knowledge that somewhere in this world, there are still good people doing good things, one small kindness at a time.